Okay, so reading comprehension. Lots of different pieces of the puzzle. Just gonna throw a bunch of different things at it. So we start with making personal connections, the text. Whenever you can, have them pause and connect and reflect, because they will understand and remember better. They will lock in their learning if they have somehow connected in that sort of what they call self-to-text way. Consolidate. You want to go back and reinforce any words that were a struggle, any ideas that were a struggle the first time they go through. So the best possible thing that you can do is not just kind of plow ahead endlessly, but sort of, let's say you finish a paragraph, and at that moment, while it's fresh, go back and say, I noticed that you had a little bit of trouble with such and such word. Let's just look at that one more time. If you kind of do that little 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it can make a big difference. In the same way, you want to summarize key points before you go on, because if comprehension is an issue, and especially if it's a long text or a novel, like a lot of stuff can sort of get lost. So you want to make sure that you're constantly doing that little overlap of backwards, forwards, where you've read something, now we're going to summarize, make sure we consolidate that, and then move forward. Predictions. So that can be a really key way of helping students anchor in the reality and details of the text and the characters and the story. You want to sort of encourage them to pause at key moments and say, wow, that's crazy, that situation that this character is in. Do you think, he's always struggled with that in the past. Like, this time he said it's going to be different. Like, do you think it's going to be different? And again, because what that's going to do is help with consolidation, because it's going to force them to go back and say, well, that time he did such and such. They're recalling details in the story, they're consolidating those details, they're remembering those details, and then they can and they're going to then loop that into their understanding as they go forward, as well as becoming more invested in the story and the characters. You also want to teach things in context that will be useful in the future. So for example, if there is figurative language comes up at a certain point. So it'll be easier for them to understand and spot and decode in the future if they know what that is. But it's not always so helpful to be like, now we're going to have a lesson on figurative language. That's not so helpful. But when you come across it in the text and you say, oh, this is actually an example of a metaphor or something. So, and then you can tell them what that is. And then in that context, they're going to understand it. And then you can say, authors use this a lot. You might want to look out for that in the future. Metacognition, so thinking about thinking, is a really important skill, especially for students who are struggling. You want them to learn how to become self-aware of their own learning process so that they're able to then stop and clarify or ask for help. And you want them to understand that, like, sometimes as we're reading, we have to be able to say, like, whoa, 1 second, was that person the one who was, at the school with that? If you're losing the thread, you have to be aware enough of your own thought process to pause and go back and check and clarify whatever it is. And so you can actually model for them asking questions as you read, right? As you're reading, you can pause and sort of show them the kind of questions that we ask ourselves as we're reading a text. In addition, on sort of a structural level, you can help them sometimes like zoom out and think about sequencing and plot structure, cast backwards and forwards, right? So we're going backwards when we summarize and forward when we predict. And looking at even talking a little bit about the plot graph and noticing where we are in the story, because it'll help, that structure will help lock things in their minds. So you can say, oh my gosh, so we know now what the conflict is, like we're wondering whether he's going to actually get into the school play or whatever it is, and then say, well, now he's already had one hurdle of the auditions, and now as the plot structure goes up, we're going to find out the next step of like, is he actually going to get, the callback, whatever it is. So as you move through the sequence of the story, just have them be aware of that structure, because it'll help them understand the direction that things are going. You also want to teach careful reading, which we'll look at in a second, and how that really helps with comprehension, using clues that authors plant and being able to sort of read between the lines. Something else that we'll look at in a second is showing them how to read in chunks as opposed to word by word, because this is actually a huge issue often for kids who are struggling with reading. Not only does it increase the speed of reading, which then in turn motivates them when they can like get through the text, because usually for some of these kids it's such a slog, like just to get to the end of a sentence, let alone a paragraph, let alone a page, let alone a novel. But it also actually radically improves their comprehension when they can read in those appropriate chunks, as opposed to, because when you're looking at each word separately, right? And then you have to add them all up later. Science, it doesn't compute. Whereas if they can grab chunks of phrases, it sort of computes better. When possible, sometimes they're working through, if you're tutoring, you might be working on something they're doing in school, but if you can, if you're just working on reading in general, see if you can find the right book for the kid, because everybody can be a reader. If they're not, they just haven't found their gateway book yet. And if they find the book that speaks to them, they will enter the world of reading much more enthusiastically. And if necessary, start with short, easy texts that are still full of meaning. There are picture books that you could talk about for hours because they're so layered and profound, where you get all the practice and you don't have any of sort of the intimidation factor of a long text. At the end of the day, only if you truly meet a student where they are will you be able to take them where they need to go. It just doesn't work any other way. Okay, and in the last one, we'll look at just a specific text and how to sort of break it down.